policy. I believe the title of it is that Washington has Yemen policy backwards. Can you explain what you mean by that, and give people in the audience who haven't read the piece yet, and we'll be happy to share it with you after this webinar, uh, what's in it and what concerns you about the UN Security Council resolution?
Yeah, so this was a piece I published in Foreign Policy. It came out last month in June. And essentially, I start the piece by pointing out that the position of the United States is to claim to be supporting peace in Yemen, when in fact, the position the United States is taking is actually perpetuating conflict as a result of UN Security Council Resolution 2216, which was passed right after the Saudis launched their military intervention in 2015. And essentially why it's perpetuating conflict is because it requires the Houthis to essentially surrender. So the terms that were passed at the time viewed the Houthis as the primary belligerents and required them to give up all territory they had acquired since 2014 and to give up all of their weapons. And at the time it was passed, it reflected the view of the UN at the time, which was that the Houthis had interrupted this process of transitional justice and an effort to move towards democratic representation that had gotten started following Arab Spring protests in Yemen. And the Gulf Cooperation Council, as well as the UN, had been involved in trying to support this movement towards greater representation in Yemen, such as through the National Security or the National Dialogue Conference, which had brought together many different groups within Yemen to come up with a framework for a new constitution. It was really lauded at the time for including women and including young people. So Yemen had emerged as this success story. After the Arab Spring, they'd managed to get their president to step down after almost a year of protests that were often violent. Many people were killed. But it seemed that Yemen was moving towards a really exciting process of potentially democratic transition. And so when the Houthis essentially rejected the outcome of the National Dialogue Conference and turned to violence in order to pursue their own desired outcome, at the time, the UN really wished to condemn that very strongly. However, unfortunately, what we've seen since then is essentially, as a result of the Saudi-led intervention, absolute devastation in Yemen, the ongoing blockade that the Saudis are carrying out against the Yemeni population, in particular against the Houthi-controlled areas, has pushed the majority of the country to the brink of famine. The UN and groups like the World Food Program have been sounding the alarm about this for years. People are simply continuing to die. The statistic you hear is that during 2021, the estimate is that a child will die approximately every 75 seconds as a result of either lack of food or other results of the blockade. So perhaps lack of medical care or clean water. So essentially, just when the United States says that it is supporting Saudi peace efforts, what it is supporting is Resolution 2216, which requires the Houthis to essentially surrender or to give up their weapons and their territory. And because the Houthis are winning, essentially, they have no incentive to do so. And so what I argue in the piece is that the UN Security Council must impose or must introduce a new resolution to guide the international system, the international community's approach to Yemen, because up to this point, Saudi Arabia continues to use that justification provided by 2216 to continue to fight against the Houthis, to continue to launch airstrikes, and to continue to maintain this blockade, which is also itself legitimized by the UN, which seems a little crazy, but I'm just trying to explain how sort of at the time, it reflected international frustration with the fact that the Houthis had derailed what was supposed to be this exciting transition process. And yet now here we are over 6 years later, and conditions on the ground simply don't reflect that anymore. And it really is long past time for the UN Security Council and the United States to push for a new approach to resolving the conflict. And one other point I'll make there, essentially that the current framework that is being applied in Yemen incentivizes conflict and incentivizes groups to take up weapons, such that we had, for example, the nephew of the former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was in charge in the former North Yemen from 1978 until the unification of Yemen in 1990, and then remained in charge until he finally stepped down in 2012. So he had previously fought alongside his uncle against the Houthis, and then joined with the Houthis when his uncle joined them in his attempt to take power back. Yemen is very complicated, but happy to get into details if people want to hear more about that. But essentially, he has taken up weapons. Other groups have taken up weapons because they know that this is the only way for them to have a seat at the table. Whereas we're not seeing adequate efforts to try to include these groups that had been included earlier in the political transition process: women, young people, civil society organizations, Islamist groups, others that have not taken up weapons. And so essentially, I have heard a lot of frustration about groups in Yemen that actually really reject the point that I'm making, because they see it as sort of giving in to the Houthis, essentially that a new UN Security Council resolution would give in to the fact that the Houthis embraced violence. And so I just wanted to make the point that in the framework that I'm calling for the UN to impose, or to reframe the international community's approach to Yemen, it is very important that all efforts are made to empower the voices of groups who have not embraced violence, so that the embrace of violence is not further incentivized.